Peer Review is a series of podcasts designed to shed light on the extraordinary breadth and diversity of talent that sit in the House of Lords. The House of Lords often gets a bad rap because it is thought to be a house of cronies and it is an unelected house. But I hope through these interviews you will see that there is this extraordinary talent, there is a great knowledge and experience, and with that I leave you to draw your own conclusions. My guest today is the best-selling author and screenwriter Michael Dobbs. Michael, thanks so much for sparing the time. I guess you'd have been in the House of Lords a lot earlier. You came in 2010, had you not had a blazing row with Thatcher. Tell us a bit about that row that you had with Margret Thatcher.
Oh, the wonderful Margaret. I should start by saying I worked with her for well over a decade, very closely. And I lasted longer than most. Politics isn't about sort of cuddles and kisses. It's about horrible things and getting kicked. And, you know, that's how you go into it. So I lasted longer than most. I was the chief of staff of the party. I remember becoming chief of staff of the Conservative Party. They hadn't had one before. And I asked a chap called Norman Tebbit, my dear old friend in politics, Norman Tebbit, what's this chief of staff job mean, Norman? And he said, well, lad, he said, there comes a time in every war when those who are in charge require that somebody be taken out into the courtyard, put up against a wall and shot. He said, your job is to find those bodies until the time comes when you will be that body. And he was absolutely right. I had an extraordinary time as chief of staff until I found myself facing Margaret in a terrible rage, terrible frustration, in her worst moment, thinking that she was about to lose the 1987 election, a week to go, and she blamed it all on me.
Why did she blame it on you?
Oh, because there were 6 of us in the room. The other 5 were cabinet ministers. So, you know, when you decide that you want to make a sacrificial lamb out of somebody, make sure they're further down the pecking order than cabinet level. So I was the only choice. And it was ridiculous. It was an utterly ridiculous row because a week later she came back with a record majority for the 3rd time. But,
But did your relationship ever recover?
No, never.
No, never. And you'd been with her in Brighton when the bomb happened?
I'd been with her since 1975. I was the first person. I was with her at her count in Finchley in 1979. And I was the first person to be able to tell her, Margaret, congratulations, you are Prime Minister. And, I'd been with her through thick and thin. And
just sticking with the Brighton bomb for a minute, where were you and how did that strike you?
At that time, I was Norman Tebbit's special advisor.
And Norman was chairman of the party?
No, he was the Secretary of State for Trade and Industry. So Norman and his wife Margaret were very close personal friends. I drove them to the Grand Hotel. And I was with them most of the time. Actually, the day of the bomb, the day before the bomb, we spent most of that day in his room working on a big speech. But I wasn't staying directly beneath the bomb. I was staying on the 6th floor, very close to the bomb. But if you remember those photographs of the Grand Hotel, the bomb damage went up and down. It broke like a chimney in the edifice in the front of the Grand Hotel because it was a huge Victorian brick-built hotel. So the party walls buffered everything. Had it been a new-built hotel, the whole thing would have collapsed. So I was actually closer to it than Margaret and Norman, but I wasn't in the way.
Terrible time. And, of course, despite your row with Margaret Thatcher, you ended up working quite closely with John Major.
Well, sometimes it helped. The two were a bit of chalk and cheese. Yes, I was deputy chairman of the party, Conservative Party, for John Major. And I also ended up trying to organise a prime ministerial debate, televised debate. We'd never had one in those days. And Tony Blair had said, I will debate this man wherever, whenever. And so, as we were in a great deal of trouble in terms of the polls, we decided to take him at his word. And my job was to work with the powers that be to organise the first ever televised prime ministerial debate. And of course, the Labour Party put up Peter Mandelson. So there ain't no way that Peter was going to deal with me and agree with me a debate when, frankly, Tony Blair had everything going for him.
And of course, all this fed into your incredible book, The House of Cards, but we'll come back to that in a minute. I mean, you started life as the son of a nurseryman in Hertfordshire, am I right?
Well, yes, sort of. It was a sort of nursery. It was a bit of a mess. I think it went broke. And my first real memory of my father is he was unemployed for over a year while he was looking around for the job that he thought he should have, which didn't come. So, yeah, it was very...
so it was a tough upbringing, not full of cash and all the rest of it.
Oh, goodness me, no cash at all.
And you got to Oxford, but in between that, you did have some time in Berlin, which must have been fascinating in the 60s.
Ah, yes. I was very lucky because I went to grammar school. Nobody had been to university in my family before me, and so I applied. Of course, I applied for Oxford, and somehow I got there. I still don't know quite how. But because the system in those days, it left me a good chunk of the year off before I went up to Oxford. So I had a German girlfriend at the time, so of course I needed to learn German and follow her back to Germany. So I went to Berlin to learn German for 4 or 5 months. And this was in early 1968. So the wall wasn't even 5 years old. It was vicious. It was horrid. It was just as if somebody had taken a huge meat cleaver and just sliced the city in two, houses in two, families in two, and people were still being shot trying to escape.
And were you living with a German family, or
I went there and lived with a family of Flüchtlinge, refugees. They had been living in East Berlin. People nowadays probably won't remember, but there was a division between East and West Berlin, which suddenly the communists decided they had to make absolutely secure. Because frankly, everybody in the East was just flooding over to the West, and they knew they had to stop it. So almost overnight, the entire city was cut in two with barbed wire, breeze block walls, and simply bricking up of windows and doors. And while that process was going on, people were just rushing, grabbing suitcases of their possessions and running literally for their lives through the gaps in the wall. I stayed with a family of refugees who had just come across with 3 or 4 suitcases. And they discovered that in those suitcases was Grandma's reading glasses. Now, Grandma wasn't able, she was too old, hadn't come across with them. So you had a family absolutely cut in two. No way of corresponding, no way of contacting each other. So they asked me to buy a visa and go across the wall to Grandma in East Berlin and take her reading glasses and some other bits and pieces and messages with her.
Oh, amazing.
It was also horrible because you saw what East Berlin and communism was all about. They'd ruined what was one of the greatest cities in Europe, but also what it did to the people. I mean, I think it was my birth in politics, if you like, and the right way of doing things and the wrong way of doing things.
And stood you in very good stead for further writings that you did later on in life. So having left Berlin, gone to Oxford, you then decided to go to America, where you went for further education, much to my amazement, and I think your parents' amazement too, in nuclear defense studies.
Yes. There was another girl.
Did you make that up?
She was American. She lived in New York and I lived in Boston. And I thought this was on my map in those days, Boston and New York only seemed to be about half an inch apart. This was before the internet, before everything that we have nowadays. So I decided to do another degree. Yes, it was the time of Richard Nixon. It was the time of Brezhnev. It was the time of the Cold War just beginning to thaw a little bit. It's the time of the first time the West ever spoke to China. It was America was still at war in Vietnam. It was the most extraordinary moment in international affairs. Everything was going on, and I was studying it. I was part of it. I was working on articles at the Boston Globe over it.
Yeah, you were at the Boston Globe for 3 or 4 years, weren't you?
Yeah, I paid my way through school, really, by working nights at the Boston Globe. It was an extraordinary occasion because it was Richard Nixon. It's commonplace nowadays to mock him and scorn him as being a man who was just corrupt and Mr. Wicked. Actually, at the time, he came very close to being one of the greatest ever American presidents.
Mm.
He, for the very first time, he did a deal with the Soviet Union to stop the nuclear arms race. He actually made the world a very much safer place. He did many other things too. But it was a fascinating lesson. Watergate, which brought him down, was all about one silly, stupid, bugged phone in some Democrat's office, which, because of Nixon's makeup, his personality, his feeling that everybody was always out to get him, he was paranoid. It was one of the things that made him president, because he felt that he had to do this to show them they were all wrong. But of course, it also brought him down. He destroyed himself. And at the Boston Globe, for 18 months during Watergate, I watched the most powerful man in the world destroying himself night by night by night until it became absolutely inevitable. It was a Shakespearean drama writ large, and I had a ringside seat.
And this, of course, is another thing that set you in good stead for your writing coming into the late stages. And it was in 1989 that House of Cards, this brilliant story that you created based on your political experience, part of which was during the Thatcher years.
Yeah.
I mean, it's probably very easy for you to answer where you got the inspiration from, but it just hit an incredible chord.
Well, House of Cards isn't about politics at all. It's about people in politics. It's not about policies. It's not about the economy. It's not about foreign affairs. It's about people and power. And I think the origin of it was probably I think I must have been about 13 years old in school. My English master threw a copy of Shakespeare at me. Shakespeare, all I wanted to do was to get out and play rugby and play cricket, and I had Shakespeare. And then I read it. It was Julius Caesar. It's a fantastic story how the most powerful man on earth gets chopped, hacked and stabbed to death on the steps of his own capital by his best mates, who then go off and kill each other. And I thought, hang on, this is quite fun, this story. I like Shakespeare.
Sounds like the modern-day Conservative Party.
Well, indeed. Well, so when I came to write House of Cards, after having had that experience with Margret, having her where she humiliated me in front of our colleagues, I thought, well, I suddenly saw what was happening to her too. She was beginning to sow the seeds of her own destruction. And it just became a very interesting and colourful thing to write about, which is about the destruction.
So your time at the Boston Globe stood you in very good stead. You found writing pretty easy as a result of it.
I think that the writing never came. It was never too much of a mountain to climb. But what I was able to see, we so often see politicians, or we so often see history in two dimensions. Winston Churchill, for instance, that man, that great bulldog, that warrior figure. But everyone, Richard Nixon, Margret Thatcher, Winston Churchill, any person I've ever met in politics is so much more of a richer personal story. And you cannot understand their politics without understanding the individual, the flesh and blood, and what drove them into public life in the first place.
Well, I think that's the same about the Lords, actually. Part of the reason for doing these podcasts is that people have such a rich life story, and you don't actually know about it. All you see is how they're portrayed politically. But Churchill, who you mentioned a moment ago, then became the inspiration for a whole series of books, starting with Churchill's War in 2002, I think.
Winston's War, if I may.
Winston's War, even better, yeah. to you. And then you wrote 4 books, I think, on Churchill.
4 books, a television play, and I'm working on some other bits and pieces on him too.
And what's your take?
My take is, the first time I switched on to Churchill was when I was watching his funeral, his state funeral in 1965. And we were watching it on a little old black and white television, with my mother, who was in floods of tears from the beginning to the end. And she'd never met Churchill. She was inconsolable. And I kept asking myself, who is this man who has had such an effect on my mother that his death as an old man of 90 has reduced her to tears? And that just started getting me to ask questions and open doors and discovering what I regard as the much more interesting and deeper truth behind Churchill than most history books, the two-dimensional approach that I mentioned. He was an extraordinarily complex, wounded character. He had his own deep, dark places inside him. His relationship with his father was a nightmare, which drove him on all his life. And again, it's another example of somebody who was pushed into public life because of various demons in his private life. And one of those, the greatest in my view, was the ghost of his father that was constantly sitting on his shoulder, whispering in his ear, Winston, you're not good enough. You're never going to be good enough. And, we seem to think that because he was Winston Churchill, he was a completely made man, but actually there were various parts of him that never quite fitted together.
And he was very unpopular amongst his colleagues because he was thought to be ambitious. I mean, people talk about likenesses to Boris Johnson, and there are distinct similarities, aren't there?
Oh, Boris talks about the likenesses of Boris and Churchill.
And you know them both, of course.
Very good book about it. Yes. The thing that's always impressed me about both Winston Churchill and Margret Thatcher is that politics is often about compromise, but it is fundamentally about belief in values and what you think is right or wrong. Or at least it should be. It's not about running around after others saying, what do you want? And I'll give it to you. Although that seems to be a bit of a modern habit, if I can put it that way. But both Winston and Margaret literally put their lives on the line. They put their careers on the line. They put their fortunes, their reputations, and their mortal lives on the line for what they believed in. And they thought that it was that important. And that's why, in the end, they were so successful, because they knew what they wanted, and they knew the risks that they were taking, and they were going to ask others to take for that purpose. And that's what great leadership is about. To me, it's not. I think
most people would concur with you. In 2007, you must have had a premonition because you wrote a book called The Lord's Day, or was it called Lord's Day?
No, The Lord's Day. Yeah, thank you.
Which was involved, I think, around a death in the chamber, which you're not allowed to die. Who'd have known you? Well, you probably did hope and know that you would end up there, but it's an incredibly readable book, and you must have done a lot of research on it.
Well, I had been told that I was going to be sent to the Lords much earlier than that. But politics being politics, when the postman came round, the letter wasn't there. You know what it's like. So I assumed that I was never going to get into the House of Lords. It was never sort of a great ambition of mine, but it was a job. It was a part of the political public system. So I wrote this book, and it is about awful things going on in the chamber of the House of Commons. I'm trying to be
House of Lords.
House of Lords, I beg your pardon. Thank you for that. I'm trying to be a little mysterious about it, so people will rush off and buy the book to find out. And anyway, it's.
I can give them one of my copies.
As I was writing this book, this is the way the system works. As I was writing this book, I began to think, the security in the House of Lords around the state opening of Parliament is really rubbish. Much worse than I thought it had been.
The state opening of Parliament is when the King or the Queen comes and opens Parliament, and there's this huge procession. Everyone's dressed up. We're all in our ermine, etc.
Everybody is there. The royal family, the lords, the commons, the judges, the ambassadors, almost all of the powerful men and women, the most powerful men and women in the country are there in one room. Now, you can see where my imagination led me. And I began to get a little worried about this. It's a sort of Guy Fawkes. But Guy Fawkes had failed in sort of 600 years or whenever it was ago. And nobody had done a thing about it ever since. They thought, well, Guy Fawkes, we foiled that plot, so we don't need to worry. I got very worried about this, and I tried to alert the authorities. I wrote to them. I wrote several letters to all sorts of people, including, in the end, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner. And then nobody, I think there's a system in government where you correspondence secretaries have various piles of letters, and there's something called the nutters pile, where you put letters that know are just... anyway, I think my letters must have gone on the nutters pile. I heard absolutely nothing until the book was published, and then all hell broke loose. How dare you? What do you mean? You're exposing all of this nonsense, all of the flaws in our security. I said, well, I've been trying to warn you. An official inquiry was set up to find out who had leaked all this stuff to me. And I kept saying, look, there is nobody who's leaked this stuff to me. I got it all from the public domain. And that's what I've been trying to tell you. Anybody could do this. So pull your socks up, get your act into shape. And I'm sort of glad to say that as a result of the book, they did make various changes to it, which I thought were long overdue.
Well, it's a brilliant book. And by 2010, of course, the rest is history. You joined the great House of Lords and have been a considerable contributor. You're always there, despite the heavy work schedule and flying back and forwards to Los Angeles to oversee the American version of House of Cards, as well as other work, screenplays you're involved in. I suppose for someone who's got very strong views on Brexit, the Lords has been a fascinating place to be in. I mean, I've been debated to death by listening to the endless speeches on pro and anti, but you've made some incredible, valuable ones. I mean, what was your take on Brexit? Why were you so strongly for leaving?
I'm against sort of systems that just get bigger, more bureaucratic, more blobby, and that become more insensitive. Which is where I think the EU is headed. It's managing decline when I think there's a better option. I mean, I couldn't be happier than to be a European. Europe has been the source of a great deal of trouble from time to time, but so much beauty, so much art, so much inventiveness, so much great literature, so many wonderful ideas. And I just feel that we're losing touch with all the things that made Europe, which was a collection of different people with different cultures, that made it great and was the most powerful thing for 1,000 years of history. I think we're losing it. I think that there are ways of getting it back. I was a Brexiteer, not because I thought that it would make much difference economically. I mean, somebody said that the harder I train, the luckier I get. Yeah. Well, I reckon the harder I work, the wealthier I get. So that's at the end of the day is what economics is down to. But there's something much more fundamental than just money in this world. It's about relationships. It's about society. It's about cultures. And I think we're missing today so much of the richness that was there and should be there. So I was a very keen Brexiteer.
And then, of course, we went into COVID, and I think it's fair to say you're suffering from long COVID, or some of the results of COVID, which have been pretty debilitating, but happily hasn't affected your workload.
Well, funny, it sort of has. I mean, what I have is I've had a couple of, I don't know whether this is relevant, but I've had a couple of years of medical, I wouldn't say nightmares, but real medical issues. I had cancer, which dominated 1 year. And as soon as I sort of got through that, then I've lost all my balance. I've lost
Which is a COVID-related thing.
It's probably. It was a virus, whether it was COVID or not, who knows. But it's robbed me of all my balance. It's affected my hearing. It's affected my eyes, so I don't see properly. So it does have it's not life-ending until I fall downstairs, which I probably will. But it is certainly life-changing. But I can't drive a car anymore. My eyes just won't.
That's a relief.
Allow me. Well, fortunately, I made the
to those that go down the Wylye Valley, which is where you're taking your title from.
I made the great strategic decision many years ago of marrying the chauffeur, so that's worked out very well. But very seriously, it's. I've had to reassess lots of things in my life over the last couple of years, and I've come out of this very much happier, more balanced, and more satisfied with the things that are important to me than I ever was before, when you were running around like a hamster in a wheel all the time. It takes a moment for you to step back and see life in the round. And I've been forced to do that. I'm deeply happy that I've been forced to do that, because I think I'm in a much better place than
positive.
I was.
And now you're writing a lot. You're doing a screenplay, and which we're not allowed to talk about. Sorry, am I?
I've got lots of projects. I'm just about to finish off a novel. I've got 2 big television projects in the wings or moving forward, and I've got a play that I want to finish off. I've been working on it for many years now. It got put to one side because of COVID and lockdown, but I'm within 2 weeks of finishing it off, and I've got lots of other things I want to do like that. So I'm raring to go.
It's an amazing story. I'm sure your parents, I assume, are not here with us at the moment, but must have been immensely proud, and all your family.
Well,
were they when you got made a peer?
My mother died in 1974, so it was 50 years ago almost. Yeah. And she never saw her grandchildren. She never saw the things that I was able to do. She was a very modest lady who came from a very difficult background, from a broken family, which the consequences of which I'm still living with. But she was a real fighter. She was a real woman of values. She said, life is tough, but I'm going to toughen you up with values, and just make sure that you make the best of things. And
so she was the anchor for how you've lived your life, really.
She was absolutely the center of our family. We were 4 children, all of whom very different, and she took care of us all. The only regret I really have in my life is that she died so young that she wasn't able to get all the benefits that hard work. She wasn't able to see her grandchildren and deal with the benefits that would have come her way. But I still see her now. Look, I've had a marvelous life. I've been so fortunate. I see her almost every day. I see she's looking up at me, because she's only a short little thing, looking up at me and saying, "Don't you forget where you came from, young man," and give me a warning before she give me a big hug and kiss. And
the great thing about you is, haven't they? You're incredibly modest about all your achievements. Going back to the Lords and the experience you've had through politics, I mean, where do you see that ending up?
My own involvement in politics, or
no, the House of Lords.
The House of Lords. I think it's in a very difficult place right now. I think when it works well, it works wonderfully well, and much better than any of the alternatives, like an elected second chamber. And it has in the past worked extremely well. I think COVID and Brexit have done the House of Lords a great deal of harm. I think it's sharpened divisions, and the House of Lords only works when it comes together rather than constantly divides. And whether we will have a House of Lords in another 10, 15 years, I don't know. But I do know that if ever anybody gets down to replacing it, they'll end up regretting it. Because an elected chamber, you see what happens in the United States, is just often two different chambers, the Commons, the Lords, the Senate and the Congress, at war with each other. And I think that it is still really worthwhile putting the House of Lords back together as it should be. But it's lost its way. It needs to find its legs again. Otherwise, an unelected chamber can't survive, because you have to justify yourself the whole time.
Well, Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and thank you very much indeed for sparing the time. And very good luck with all these projects you've got on the go. Amazing energy.
Oh, with friends like you, sir, I can't go wrong, can I?